The last step of our video is to create some API documentation. So you must have seen something similar if you've been trying to integrate a third-party API in one of your applications. So this is the Stripe API documentation, and as you can see, it has some examples of requests. What this allows is Stripe to onboard people without having to manually go there and tell them, oh, this is what you need to send to this endpoint. And this is a standard in the industry. If you want people to onboard your API, you just send them the API docs and you should have everything they need to understand what your API endpoints are expecting to receive. It's a nice and easy way to onboard people to get to use your API endpoints. So to create that kind of API documentation, we are going to be using Open API specification, and as its implementation, we are going to be using Swagger. So some people use this interchangeably, but the difference is that OpenAPI is a specifications. It tells us how API documentation should look like, and Swagger is the actual implementation. So we will be using these tools. Let me show you a quick diagram. We will be initially exposing API docs for booking service and inventory service directly from within the application. But because we don't want anyone accessing directly our internal applications, in this case booking service and inventory service, we will need to expose these API documentations through API Gateway using a unified UI to show both of these documentations, and I will also be showing you how to achieve that. You must have noticed that order service is not going to get any API documentation, and that's because we don't have any endpoints to expose. Let's start with some code. The first thing we need to do is we need to go in inventory service and let's add some dependencies. If you open your pom.xml in inventory service, we will need to add these two dependencies. The one at the top is going to help us generate the nice looking UI page we've seen, and the second dependency is going to generate a version of our API documentation that is accessible through API endpoint. So it's going to generate our documentation in JSON format. So just download the Maven changes. This will pull the dependencies. Now let's go into our application.properties. So if you go to source, main, and application.properties, we want to add a couple of properties. So the first one is springdoc.swagger-ui.path, and this is going to be the path where we will be able to access our API documentation. Let's also define the path for our API docs as a JSON that people can access through an endpoint call. So we need these two. Now let's start inventory service and let's see what gets generated. So inventory service has started successfully. Let's go to our browser and let's go to localhost 8080/swagger-ui.html. As you can see, we've got a nicely formatted API specification document where we have each endpoint with the respective parameters that it's expecting. For example, we've got a bunch of gets and our put endpoint. You can see a response object of this get request. And at the bottom, you've also got the schemas. So it tells you exactly which kind of object is going to be returned quite in detail. So this is really useful. This is the UI part. Let's say you want to access this documentation through an endpoint call. You can simply call this endpoint up here, localhost 8080/v3/API docs, and this will be sent to you as a JSON object. It will have the same content as the UI. But if you go back to the UI, we can see that it says OpenAPI definition here. We want it to say the title of our application. So we want to change this, and I will show you how to do that. Let's go back to inventory service, and we want to create a configuration package where we're going to add a configuration class. So let's call it OpenAPI config, and this is a configuration class. So let's add the tag, and we want to add a new bean that is going to return an OpenAPI object. So actually we want to call it inventory service API, and we want to give it a title. So inventory service API, and Same as here. We can see that we've defined a bunch of attributes, but there are many more that you can go and customize. You can add contact information, you can add terms of service, licenses, summaries. It's quite flexible. That's all we need. If we restart our inventory service, we go back to our browser page and let's refresh. We can see that the title has changed and we've also got a description. This is a bit more customized and looks nicer if you want to send it to someone. Let's do the same thing to booking service. So let's add these two dependencies we've just added into inventory service. So if you go to pom.xml, let's add these two dependencies. Let's go to application.properties and let's just copy them from inventory service because they are the same. And let's add a configuration class here as well. So let's create a package. Let's go to inventory service. Let's copy the content of OpenAPI config. Let's create an OpenAPI config class here. It's going to be a configuration class, so let's tag it as such. Import these dependencies. So let's change the name. So this is booking service. If we now run booking service, so the application has started successfully. Instead of port 8080, we want to go on port 8081. And we can see we've got back the endpoints in booking service. In this case, it's just a booking API. I wanted to show you quickly something. So if you go back to inventory service API documentation and you expand one of the GET requests, you can actually try it out. So what this is going to do is going to send this GET request to our backend service, and we actually get back a response because we have our service running in the background, and we do get back a good response. But what you might have noticed is that we've been accessing this documentation directly through inventory service and booking service, but we don't want external people to access these services directly. And because we got an API gateway, which is the entry point to our backend system, we want people to access this documentation through API gateway, through port 8090, which is where our API gateway is running. So let's do some changes. Open up API gateway and let's add the same two dependencies we added for inventory service and booking service. So I'll just go to inventory service and I'll copy them. Let's go to the application.properties now. So this is where things are going to be a bit different. Okay, we want to add the same Swagger UI and API docs path, but we want to use API gateway to also access booking service and inventory service documentation. And to do that, we need to define some other properties. We want to define the name of each service and the corresponding URL. We want to define the name inventory service and the URL, which is going to be docs inventory service v3 API docs. This is a URL I have defined. Instead of docs, you could have something else such as OpenAPI, or you can have gateway instead of docs, whatever works for you. But generally speaking, docs it's quite good to use as a aggregate documentation URL. And the second one is the booking service. We want to do the same thing. Only thing that is different is the service name. In this case, it's going to be booking service. This is where things get a bit different. We want to go in booking routes and we want to define a new route, and this route is going to be used to go to our API documentation in booking service. So this is what we need. We need to create a new route that basically is going to be called at this endpoint here, which is the one we have defined in our application.properties. And this request will be sent to port 8081, which is where our booking service is actually running. And when we are sending the request to this port 8081, we want to set the path to v3 API docs. If you remember, v3/API docs is the endpoint that we can use to get back documentation as a JSON. So that is what is happening over here. And we want to do the same thing for inventory service. So if you go to inventory service routes, let's add the routes for this as well. So same thing as before, we want to create a new bean and we're going to map this URL localhost 8080 v3/API docs. And now if we run API gateway, let's go to localhost 8090, which is where our API gateway is running. You can see that we're getting a 401, and this was totally expected. And that's because we have added authentication to all the endpoints in our API gateway. But we want to expose this documentation to our clients. We want our clients to access this documentation without any authentication. So how can we do that? It's quite simple. Let's go to our application.properties. Let's add a bunch of URLs we want to exclude from authorization. So this is the ones you want. You can notice we've got one for docs/$. That's where our merge documentation will be. So we want these ones. And now we need to go to security configuration. And in here, we want to do some changes. Just after authorized requests, we want to add two new method calls. So request matchers. We want to exclude these URLs. We have just defined in our application.properties. So let's add them up here. And this will be mapped to a string of excluded URLs. So what we want to do is any request coming through these URLs, we want to permit all of those. Any other, we want to authenticate it. If we rerun API gateway, let's go back to our browser, and if we refresh, we can see that we've got access to documentation through API gateway. Here at the top, we can select the service we want to see the documentation for. This way, external clients will not need to access our backend servers. They will not need to access booking service nor inventory service, which is what we want. We have built this system which is using quite a lot of components and state-of-the-art technologies which are used in the industry. I hope you learned something from this video. If you're encountering any kind of issue, please just leave a comment in the box below with as many details as possible, and I'll try my best to help you out in debugging. There are a few things that you can do to expand this project. For example, you can add a third-party API call to a payment service. So before placing an order, you can do a payment as well. That would be a nice way to implement a third-party API as well. You could, for example, use Stripe API to do some payment processing. Another thing you could do is write unit tests and integration tests. I've got a video on that as well, so please check it out. And just be creative. This is your project, make it your own. You could add some observability. You can try to add metrics and logs. And if you want me to cover any other topic, please just leave a comment in the box below.